To this now, the Life Esidimeni Inquest has found that former Gauteng Health MEC Qedani Mahlangu and Mental Health Director Dr Makgabo Manamela were negligent in the execution of their duties. The High Court in Pretoria has been looking into the deaths of 144 psychiatric patients who were moved to ill-equipped and unregistered non-governmental organizations as part of cost-cutting measures. Now, the judge, Monwa Defo, says the Provincial Health Department terminated its contract with Life Esidimeni despite expert advice not to do so.
She could have saved the many lives as she visited the NGOs and could see that they were not adequately equipped and some of the personnel were not adequately qualified to care for the mental health care users. Some of the NGOs were licensed to care for the mental health care users without following the prescribed protocols. Effectively, Ms. Qedani, Mahlangu and Dr. Manamela created the circumstances in which the deaths were inevitable.
Let's discuss this now in depth and the damning findings of this inquest. And to speak to us is former Health Ombudsman, Professor Malegapuru Makgoba, who joins us via the virtual platform from the Limpopo province. And in studio, we are joined by the Gauteng Premier spokesperson, Vuyo Mhaga. Mr. Mhaga, I want to start with you in studio here. Does the Gauteng government agree with the inquest here that these are lives that were lost needlessly as a result of this marathon project that was carried out in 2016?
No, indeed. Thank you very much for having us. Indeed, we do fully agree with the inquest. There are no reservations from the Premier, so that's where we are. It still remains a tragedy in the chapter of the Gauteng government.
For the government of Gauteng, what would the ideal next step be?
Well, the matter now is obviously with the NPA. Hopefully then they will be able to take it forward to make sure that they take it to its final conclusion, at least that aspect. And we continue, of course, to put very serious measures within the government never to experience a tragedy of the similar nature.
Yeah. Professor Makgoba, let's bring you into the conversation. You were the health ombudsman at the time of this tragedy, and you put together a report after conducting an investigation. And I want to take you back to some of those findings. On the aspect of human rights violations, this is what your report said in part. And I quote now, "There is prima facie evidence that certain officials and certain NGOs and some activities within the Gauteng Marathon project violated the Constitution and contravened the National Health Act." Now, flowing from today's inquest outcomes, for you, what should be the next steps, especially for the two officials identified by the court?
Well, I think I actually, in my summary report of the violations, you did read the word that they were the dramatis personae, and their fingerprints were peppered all over all the findings of the investigation. I do believe that now that I think the inquest has completed, it is in the hands of the NPA, I think, to take whatever course they do take. I think the moral of the story from this judgment is that no longer shall political people make decisions for which they cannot account. Decisions of this nature carry consequences not only for the patients, for the families, for the nation, and for our reputation as a country, but also they should carry consequences for the people who make those decisions, particularly when they make those decisions blind and deaf to expert advice.
Yeah.
I think as South Africa, we have had too many cases of political meddling where politicians, by receiving briefs from lunatic, I think, scientists, think that they can dictate, I think, the rules of science as we know them and as we practice them. And just like the HIV denial story and period, this is just another incident where political leadership ignored expertise, and the consequences of this are very clear.
Professor, before I come back to studio here to Vuyo Mhaga, what would be a fitting end for families who are seeking justice? We are now in the 8th year of this particular tragedy, and the families, yes, in part, they may have been, they may feel that there is some justice based on what has happened today, but the reality is it's not complete yet. And that's why I'm asking you, what would be the fitting end for these families?
I wouldn't define an end, Oli, because life is a process, it's not an event. So every step that I think that the government or the judiciary system takes in order to redress what has happened to the families constitute a form of closure. There is no single closure for one particular family that is similar to another closure for another family. So each of these families have different closures that they want out of this process. And part of the reason why I chose to recommend an arbitration as opposed to each of the families going to court was because I thought that by bringing the families together into an arbitration process, they will be able to share the burden of what they've gone through, but also they would be able to be guided by a senior jurist like Dikgang Moseneke to be able to, I think, to reclaim their dignities and to reclaim some of the things that they had lost, I think, as part of the horror that their relatives have undergone. So I don't think that we have an end. We have a process that we must follow because each family is going to request a different closure. At the moment, I'm aware that families have been compensated for. Families have wanted to have this inquest in order that there can be criminal liabilities identified, and it seems like that has happened. And now it is the process of what follows the criminal liability that obviously would bring a different kind of closure. So there's not a single closure.
Yeah.
It's a process of closures.
All right. Let's come back into studio now. Mr. Mhaga, I want to extrapolate from that Health Ombudsman report of 2017. And what it says is that some patients were transferred directly from sick bays to NGOs. Now let's remember that these NGOs were ill-equipped, without experience. They were transferred from sick bays to NGOs. Others were transferred with medical conditions that required highly specialized medical care. The professor talks about political meddling. This was a decision of a political figure that had to be forced down to officials in the administrative section of the Department of Health. And as the story goes, those officials had no choice but to implement because there was also a climate of fear. What's the lesson here for the Gauteng government?
No, thanks, Claudia. I think really the lesson for us is that first, whatever that we do, it must always be people-centered. So every decision-making must be that. And of course, those officials are professionals in their own right. They must actually obviously advise the political authority that is there. And I think that's what we must really, all of us collectively, in the civil service, take that into account, that, the advice that basically come must always be obviously highly considered. But importantly, whatever decision that is taken, the centrality of the people that you are taking a decision about must always be there. So I think that's what we've actually learned from it. And as I've said, it's a massive, massive tragedy that must never visit our province again.
Professor Makgoba, are you comforted by that statement from the provincial government spokesperson that indeed lessons have been learnt here? I see you smiling.
Well, there are too many lessons that we've learned, but we don't seem to have been able to do anything about whatever we have learned. So I'm not sure how to deal with it. I've had several investigations done in the Gauteng Department of Health and made recommendations. And I can only say this off the top of my head, I don't think 50% of my recommendations have been implemented. Now, I'm not sure what lessons are being learned, because really the role of my office is really just an oversight, an office to conscientize the nation as to where, we could do things better. And as I've often said, the office of the Ombud is not expecting the health professionals to do something that is from Pluto or from Mars. We expect, I think, a health professional to do the basics that they have been taught in terms of caring for patients, listening to patients, and giving patients the dignity that they deserve. And this culture of serving seems to have been lost, I think, over the years. And I think that should be reclaimed sooner rather than later. And I've seen this culture west in Gauteng. I've not seen it improve, but there is a new health ombud now. Maybe he has got a different experience. But during my 7 years there, I didn't see it improve. I saw a lot of arrogance, and I saw a lot of people not wanting to internalize what they have heard, but listening to you and simply believing that they have got the authority, they've got the power, they are going to rule us until Jesus Christ come back, and fortunately he has now come back.
Those are very harsh words from the professor, but I want to pick up on what he says here, and it is critical. He says 50% of what he recommended in that report, those recommendations have not been implemented. So it begs the question, have lessons really been learned?
No, they have. Actually, if you go through some of the statement that we've issued, including the fact sheet of emanating from his report, I mean, in terms of the infrastructure that we have actually had to expand, it is there. The mental, health board has been there. Actually, in almost in every district, has been there. So we have expanded, and actually we have continued to train more people to work with the professionals. Actually, there are about 27 specialists in that particular board that advises in terms of this particular work. Not only that, but also going beyond to really teach society about the effects or the mental illness, including in high schools or in schools and everywhere else. So actually there are about 9-point plans there, including to ring fence some of the funds that must be dedicated to this particular type of illness.
Professor Makgoba, I suspect here we would have to do the work of journalists and go and investigate exactly what Mr. Mhaga is saying, because otherwise we're going to sit tonight and run circles around each other. But I want to move to this next point, and again, I'm going to extrapolate from your report, because in part it says that there was inadequate preparation, particularly on the part of NGOs who were now going to be accepting these patients. Some of them operated without licenses until later. Before I ask the question, this is what, for me, it stood out as I was reading that report. And I've got to tell you, it hurt me deeply. Patients were received in an ungroomed state, smelly, without proper clothing, some of it torn, either with no shoes or one shoe. And there is a quote in inverted commas, skinny. That's the description of these people as they were being transported to these ill-equipped NGOs. I want to ask you the question, how much responsibility should those who ran these NGOs take?
Well, they should all take responsibility, Collie. You know, I mean, it is simply criminal that you can take a patient out of a hospital and go and put them in a store or in a house where there is nobody who knows how to care, how to give medication to that patient. And you know what is really even more criminal is that these are the president's patients in law, but you are taking them to places which are not licensed at all. And all the licenses were being given afterwards, you know, after people started complaining. They were not given up front. So by definition, those people were taken to an unlawful place, and their deaths were unlawful, irrespective of how they died. And this is the basic that people don't seem to appreciate what happened in Life Esidimeni. You took patients from a hospital and took them to hell and expected them to survive there and to live.
Mr. Mhaga,
which is against the law, against the Health Act, it's against the mental health, it's against the Constitution. All of these things were breached. And that's the depth and the magnitude of what happened in Life Esidimeni.
Mr. Mhaga, the professor is not holding back at all, because this is what it should be. This is what we call accountability. That report said that the Gauteng Health Department ran transfers, or ran this transfer, quote unquote, without dignity. Not my words, it's the words in that report.
No,
what was the rush?
No, I think we fully agree with the Prof in terms of how the whole transition was there. That's why I think we'll have literally taken even the step further when he recommended that let's have Tekgang Moseneke, and ultimately requested, at no point really we hold back or try to cover it up. We've actually opened it up. Because we wanted to be where we are currently, of course, we know there's an additional step that those who have been responsible at that given time, there must be a bit of accountability. But importantly, also some families go through the process of a closure. Hopefully today is just part of that particular journey, as Prof basically says.
You may say that there was no cover-up, but I will remind you of the actual process of the inquest, because it was held publicly. The officials, the government officials, including the head of government in the province at that time, Mr. Makura, he had to testify there, and it became a blame game between himself and the MEC, because the MEC was saying, I was merely implementing an instruction from the top to basically cut costs. The Premier says, no, I only learned about this through media reports when people started dying. And he says, well, if you talk about collective responsibility, it can't be, because there were people directly responsible for what happened. So again, the question has to come as to what was the rush about this project?
No, that's what I'm saying. I mean, the collective part of it, to say cut cost, I don't think it will equally mean, therefore, be unlawful, do away with people's human rights and all that. So there can be an overall look at all different departments, and then you can then see that financially you are bleeding there, and what do you do to basically deal with that? That can be an instruction that, therefore, what it means is that break all the possible laws that are there, take people to places that are unlicensed, and all that, because therefore you must then extract to say the EXCO says you must basically do that. So you can't equate that, basically the two.
Yeah. I want to perhaps finish off this thought with you before we go to the professor, that when you talk about taking responsibility, viewers listening to you tonight may possibly find it difficult to believe you when you say things have changed, because as much as these NGOs were identified as being recipients or needing to accept these patients, perhaps some of the people, and that's why they have to take responsibility, as the professor says, some of them, it may have been the motivating factor that this was going to also mean some income for the non-governmental organizations. And so they simply saw dollar signs in their eyes without thinking. But we can't brush the entire NGO sector with the same brush. And so, again, going back to lessons that have either been learned or not, today, this current government, the provincial government, has had to apologize for not paying NGOs on time. And these are people that are helping the very same government. So again, I'm asking you the question, where have these lessons been learned?
No, I mean, if you go back to the current report that we were speaking about, you've got about 144 of the NGOs that we're working with, all of them fully accredited, and all of them getting paid basically on time. And I'm saying we've basically implemented that particular thing. When then we picked it up, what we're actually currently talking about, which is a social development NGO, the Premier went and convened all the NGOs basically to say whatever that basically has happened, it must not necessarily come in. I know as a matter of fact that the DG is sitting within that particular department to make sure that he's be able to deal with some of these particular issues. So we don't, so although those issues that you're talking about in the execution of governance, so when the red signs are starting to come up, the executive, which is ultimately the Premier, literally actually convened all of them and started to put a process. Of course, part of the issues that will have then been dealt with is about double tipping and some of them not necessarily accredited. As we do that particular process, it does not necessarily mean that we then have to disrupt basically the services. Hence, I'm saying to you now, the DG of the province is actually working closer with that particular department to make sure that even the worries that are there from the government point of view does not necessarily hinder some of the services that the NGOs are actually providing, which are extremely, extremely critical.
Professor, final thoughts from you. And again, I want to preface it with an extrapolation from your report, the conclusion of that report. It said, the evidence showed the MEC and the head of department, this would have been Dr. Pani Selebano, did not share the same vision. And later, that very same head of department was, quote unquote, sidelined, and junior officials were put under pressure to do as directed. It goes back to your point, Professor, that arrogance ruled the day here. But looking ahead, is the Gauteng Health Department in better hands today, in your view?
Well, I think, you always have to give new people the benefit of doubt. And fortunately, I've had the opportunity to meet Panyasa Lusufi and the new MEC for Health, Nomantu, in relation to the Rahima Musa, I think, investigation that I did there. And I got the impression that at the time, they were ready to listen and they were ready to move on and have some actions. But, you know, this was one of my last investigations, so I've not been following it since the young lions have asked us to all come and look after our grandchildren here in the villages. So I'm away from there. But I do have some optimism, or at least some hope, that Premier Lessufi and Ms. Nomantu Ralihoko, they know the challenges that they are facing. I've spoken to them personally and directly, and I got the impression that they will do something different, but that's just the benefit of my doubt, and I will see with time what they do. What I want to disabuse, people in my country at the moment, there was never a cost-cutting necessity for the Life Esidimeni termination. I did my own studies. There was no difference between people in the NGOs and those that were in Life Esidimeni in terms of cost. And I think Barbara Creasy said that. But here is a very small point that I think people don't realize. When Jack Bloom asked Qedani how many people had died in the provincial government, Qedani said there was 36 deaths that could be recorded. At that time, when she said there were 36 deaths, there were actually over 70 deaths that had already occurred in the NGOs.
Sure.
So here you have a situation where the MEC, obviously, either she has been misinformed or she was being economical with the truth to say to the nation that there are 36 people that have died when actually there are over 70. So what does that mean?
Yeah.
In our society, a society whose constitution is based on human rights.
Professor, I know this was the last question, but I can't help but hear from your voice that you want action to be taken here. Is it your view that ultimately someone must go to jail for what has happened here? Because these were lives of human beings. Yes, they may have been mentally handicapped, but the Bill of Rights guarantees us all human dignity. What happened here is a tragedy. What do you want to see happen, Professor?
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I think the legal system or the judicial system of our country has got processes and mechanisms through which I think they redress any aberrations that we undertake. So I believe in the fairness of the system, and I think the law must take its course, but it must take that course in a fair and a just manner. So that I think there is a broader understanding why we created a constitution that is based on human rights. Otherwise, it's like we've written the constitution on paper and we're just banning it, just as the DA did it, I suppose, during the recent campaign, or in a schematic way. But all I'm trying to say is that there's a reality here of people's lives, people's relatives that have died. And if you were in my situation in those 3 months when I was doing the investigations, and you listened to the story, and you saw some of the patients, and you saw the places where they were, and you ask yourself, why did we have a constitution that is so strongly human rights based, but we behave in the complete opposite of that constitution? And of course, the Life Esidimeni may be one small example of a group that was vulnerable, that could not answer for itself, that were almost like kids. But how many of these incidents are happening in our country where we are actually trampling over the constitution that we have made the cornerstone of our law? So yes, I think I want some action to take place, but I want that action to be fair, because I think the legal system has got processes and ways of addressing such a matter.
Professor Malegapuru Makgoba, I want to thank you very much for your time, the former health ombud, joining us tonight, reflecting on Life Esidimeni. Mr. Vuyo Mhaga from the Premier's office in Gauteng, I want to thank you very much for your time tonight.